Hello and welcome to Talk of Today, where we explore developments in science, technology, and society, and what they could mean for the future. I'm your host, Sam Barton. If you ask people, what do they want in life? Many will tell you they just want to be happy. But what does that actually mean? Moral philosophers have largely focused on ideas relating to the flourishing of sentient beings. And I'd say that it is safe to assume that a big part of what makes for a flourishing life is that the person living it is happy, or at least happy for a significant portion of it. So what actually makes us happy? What effects do the decisions we make have on our subjective well-being? How does money or parenthood affect our happiness? What effects do new technologies like smartphones and constant connectivity have on how happy we are? If happiness, subjective well-being, or flourishing is important, which I'm sure we'd all agree that it actually is, answering these questions has profound consequences for how we choose to organize our societies and the choices that we make. Joining us today to help shed some light on these questions, we have Kostadin Kushlev, an assistant professor in psychology at Georgetown University, where he leads the Digital Health and Happiness Lab, exploring questions of how digital technologies affect health and well-being. His previous work has covered things like the relationship between income and happiness, as well as that of parenthood and happiness as well. You can find show notes for this conversation on my website at samhbarton.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by sharing it on social media or by becoming a patron. For as little as $2 a month, you can help make this podcast possible. Head to samhbarton.com for more information or head directly to patreon.com/samhbarton. If you'd like to keep up to date with new episodes and everything else I've got going on, you can subscribe to my newsletter through my website or follow me on social media at samhbarton. And without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Kostadin Kushlev.
So my name is Kostadin Kushlev, and I am currently an assistant professor at Georgetown University in the Department of Psychology, where I focus on the areas of social psychology and health psychology.
And how did you come to get into this line of work? Like, what's been your career trajectory over the past few years?
Well, they often say that research is me search, and I think that definitely applies in my case. Now, I got my first iPhone, I think, in 2012, and I think it was the iPhone 4, so I resisted the change for a few years. And
iPhone 4 was a very good one.
Yes.
I remember the iPhone 4. When that came out, that was a step above it. Sorry. Continue.
Yeah, that finally convinced me. And, in the months after I got my first smartphone, I noticed a couple of things. First of all, lots of daily tasks became a lot more convenient and easy. I was thinking recently how I can't even remember how I actually did simple things that I do every day now, such as when I, go to meet somebody in a new part of town. I don't plan where I'm going to have lunch after or how am I going to get back home. I just start, going and find directions on my phone, all of these things. So it's really transformed how we do all these simple daily tasks. But the other thing I noticed is that it became more difficult for me to focus on what I was doing. And I was doing my PhD at the time. So sustained attention is important for writing your dissertation. And so with that, I just became really interested in how all these notifications initially, but then more generally how just the presence of these, of the internet in our pockets at all times might be changing our attention, and in particular how it might be changing our attention in the context of social interactions.
So it was your own experiences with technology and trying to get stuff done that really has prompted a lot of your work.
That's right. And if, we have to look back at a particular moment when I decided that I'll be doing my dissertation specifically on the topic of smartphones within the context of social interactions. I can remember the moment. I was actually at a great music festival in British Columbia called Bass Coast. It's kind of electronic music, and I was dancing and sort of thinking in my head. I guess dancing helps me think. And it was just this very clear moment of when I was excited. That's something novel. Nobody's really studying this. Nobody's doing, systematic, programmatic research on this topic. And so I found my calling that way. And I'm still doing that.
Smartphone calling.
6 or 7 years later.
Yeah, that's wonderful, wonderful. So when I was doing research for this, the way, and my girlfriend asked me, so what are you talking about? What's the topic? I framed it as, you are a behavioral scientist and you look into well-being and how different variables in our life affect our well-being at the individual level, but at the societal level. Is that a good way of characterizing your work?
Yes. So beyond the specific research on technology and well-being, yes, I've looked at the effect, for example, of income on well-being, progressive taxation on well-being. Now, a different side of that question that I've become more interested recently is what are the consequences of having higher well-being. So there is this exciting new research that's emerging that suggests that happier people tend to be healthier. Now, of course, healthier people also tend to be happier, but there's evidence that there is causal effect of happiness on physical health. It also seems to be associated with better citizenship, meaning that you might be more involved at your workplace or more involved with, various causes, helping society and that sort of thing. So basically, I'm interested in both the antecedents of well-being, but also the consequences of well-being.
So if we were trying to pitch happiness to some, heartless politicians who only want to maximize economic growth, we could actually say, well, actually having a population could be vital in trying to promote economic growth, or to try and promote economic interests in your country.
Exactly. Yes. So the research clearly suggests that it actually pays to invest in the well-being of the population, because yes, happier people are, they would work harder, for example, they would contribute more to society. It is really a goal because, I think part of the bias here comes with thinking of happiness as goal in and of itself, which is true. I mean, it's, generally good to be happy. But yes, if you're a heartless, economist or something and just worried about...
There's lots of economists with hearts out there. I'm being a bit...
Yes,
I'm being a bit
and maximizing GDP, then, that is not of interest to you. But it turns out that happiness is not only goal in and of itself, but it's actually good for all these other outcomes that we value, including health, productivity, and general being a good citizen.
So how do we measure happiness? And what's in a lot of your work is a lot of it's focused on happiness, and there's this term well-being, which is thrown around a lot as well. What are the differences there, and how do we measure things like happiness and subjective well-being?
Yeah, so I would say that, subjective well-being and happiness could be used interchangeably. So one answer is that subjective well-being is just the more technical term for the more general concept of happiness. And, of course, subjective well-being has a specific definition, whereas happiness, everybody can decide what happiness is. So that's why the literature often talks about subjective well-being rather than happiness in general. Now, so in terms of how we measure subjective well-being, there's really three components that everybody seems to agree on. And those three components are relative frequency of positive emotions. So that includes things like joy, calm. There's various types of positive emotions, both sort of energetic positive emotions, but also, relaxed, peaceful, and so forth. So low energy positive emotions. And so that's the first component. The second component is relatively infrequent experience of negative emotions, anger, sadness, and so forth. Now, it's important to emphasize here that it's fine, it's normal to have negative emotions. So nobody's talking here about creating a society of Pollyannas that, never experience any negative emotions, or, doing some sort of affirmations, self-affirmations every night so that you suppress all anger and self-doubt and that sort of thing. So we're not trying to suppress negative emotions. We recognize them as a normal part of human experience. But at the same time, obviously, if you're constantly sad or angry, then that's, score lower on in terms of subjective well-being. So these are sort of the emotional or affective components of well-being. And there is more cognitive components of well-being. So that's more questions about how you think about and view your life and yourself. And the most common way to measure that is a questionnaire or a question about life satisfaction. So these components of well-being are related to each other, but they're also distinct from each other. And in fact, they do relate differently to some of the predictors of well-being, such as income, for example.
Are there, out of the three components, let's say, of subjective well-being, is there one that's more important than the others?
Yes. So I would say, if I had to pick, I would say positive emotions is, perhaps the most important one, because it really, positive emotions is about, and it's measured, it's asking how you feel on a day-to-day basis. So it's measuring essentially your happiness throughout your daily life rather than how you are thinking about your life. Now, for example, you could be, very successful. You could have a large house, a great car, and so forth. So, so when you ask about how satisfied you are with your life, you could say, oh, I'm pretty satisfied. I have it pretty good. But then when I start measuring your emotion about how you feel in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, it's possible that you don't actually experience a lot of positive emotions, even though you're satisfied with your life, because, at 5 o'clock, you're stuck in terrible traffic. At 12 o'clock, your boss, isn't letting you go to lunch because there's a project you need to do and that sort of thing, right? So I'd say that's the most important if I had to pick one. And in fact, the research looking at the consequences of subjective well-being often focuses on positive emotions. So if you are experiencing regular positive emotions, you tend to, in the long term, be healthier, for example, live longer and so forth.
So does that mean that there's just, like, if you're high in neuroticism, you're just on average just going to be less of a happy person?
Yeah. So neuroticism.
And if you don't mind, could you just talk a little bit about the big 5 personality traits as well, just for some context?
Sure.
Sorry,
neuroticism is one of the 5 big 5 personality traits. And most of the other personality traits, such as extroversion or agreeableness, tend to be positively related to measures of subjective well-being, whereas neuroticism tends to be negatively related to subjective well-being. And neuroticism, I'm not a personality psychologist, but generally it means the propensity to experience kind of stronger emotions, including negative emotions. I guess on average, first of all, it is true that some of us are just now. I should say here, personality traits are largely genetically determined. So, there are some environmental factors, but generally, genes determine whether somebody is neurotic or not. So it is fair actually to say that some of us are born with a little bit happier dispositions than others. But of course, we're talking here about small effects. So yes, subjective well-being has an effect on physical health, but it's not the one determining factor. So you could certainly be a neurotic person who is also pretty healthy. It's just a little less likely that you'll be as healthy as somebody who is not as neurotic. But, it's not a one-to-one relationship. So you could have a neurotic person that's healthier and, more involved in the community than somebody who is low in neuroticism.
So let's say that I wished to track my own subjective well-being every single day. What would I track? Like, would I ask myself to rate my happiness on a scale of 1 to 10 once a day? Or what would be the easiest way for, just your average citizen who's interested in seeing their happiness across time? How would you recommend they go about that?
Yeah, so the best way, sort of the gold standard of measuring emotions is something called experience sampling, or ESM. And essentially what that involves is that at usually random times of the day, you're sent a message with a questionnaire which asks you, how do you feel right now? And then now, what exactly is the scale? Yeah, frequently it's 1 to 5, 1 to 7, standard scales. And, the scale could be something like, 1, not very happy, to 7, extremely happy. Often it's a little bit more general than that. And it kind of assesses mood. So how do you feel right now? From 1, it would be anchored at bad, I feel bad, to 5, good. And the reason for that is that, again, happiness, so people have a lot of theories and philosophies about what happiness means, whereas good and bad are a little bit more neutral in that respect. And so anyway, so the best way to measure it is to measure how people are feeling at particular moments throughout their day. Now, of course, that's the most involved way. And so the effects, the findings that you read about who is the happiest nation and stuff like this from these national representative surveys, most of them are based on a single question that measures life satisfaction. So how satisfied are you with your life? And that's what we're looking at, rather than this, multiple times a day for, a week type of measurement.
So how, I understand that you've taken this idea of this measure of subjective well-being, and you've looked at how different variables and how different things in life can affect it. Let's begin with technology and smartphones. What's the relationship between smartphone usage and maybe how much we actually use it, how much we actually use these technologies, and subjective well-being?
A number of researchers have looked at that question, and the answer tends to be contradicting. So some studies have found that phone use over time has been associated with increase in loneliness and depression, especially in young populations. A recent study by Shabilsky in Nature Human Behavior found no relationship between mobile phone use and happiness. And so my research really doesn't focus on this net effects question, because in some ways, the net effects question is, breezing over the complexities of these devices. My perspective is that these devices have become so prevalent because they are great, very useful, convenient, make our lives better in a lot of ways. So they certainly have benefits for well-being, and some of my research shows that. But they also, by being so convenient and easy and fun to use, have sort of infiltrated our lives and infiltrated other activities that are essential for human happiness, such as, spending quality time with one's family, friends, and so forth. And so it's these subtle costs that I've focused on exploring. And I've shown that in many different social situations, from, parents spending time with their children to, friends spending time with each other, phones can have these subtle effects on well-being, not necessarily ruining your dinner with your family, but just making you perhaps enjoy it a little less than you might have otherwise.
Okay, so just to make sure I've got this clear, it's not that smartphone usage makes us more sad or feel worse. It's just that because because we're using these phones in at times where we might be interacting with other people or doing other things, it's the loss of the potential happiness that we would have gotten from those interactions that is actually causing this change, or this change in subjective well-being.
Exactly. So that's precisely the question that I've tried to provide evidence for. So it's the opportunity cost. What is being lost by, looking down at your phone during a conversation, maybe even once? Does that derail the conversation? How do you feel about your connection with others at the end? Do you feel listened to when your partner is on their phone while you're talking to them, that sort of thing. Now, that's not to say that, there isn't other research suggesting that there are more direct effects of these technologies on well-being. Now, most of the research in that area has focused on social media. And by social media, I really mean Facebook, because the majority of the social media research is focusing on use of Facebook. And, there are some really interesting findings in that area. One distinction is the distinction between passive and active use of social media. So the research seems to suggest that when you go on Facebook and, you post something and you interact with others, you comment on others' posts, that sort of thing, well, that's actually associated with greater happiness. But passive use, which means you're just scrolling through the feed, looking at what other people are doing, having, great vacations while you're working, for example, that sort of use is associated with lower well-being, for example. So there are direct effects, but when part of my perspective is that to study smartphones, what does that mean, right? There's so many things you can do on the smartphone. So I'm not interested in the effects of each of those things, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or email. I'm more interested in the fact that whichever one of those things you're doing, you're missing out on other opportunities to experience greater joy in your life. And I should say here that I've focused on the context of social interactions here, because if there is one secret to happiness, sometimes as a well-being researcher, I get asked that, what's the secret to happiness? And my answer is, and the research suggests the answer is, social interactions and social relationships, right? So all very happy people have one thing in common, and that is they have at least a couple, if not more, close friends that they can confide in, or whether friends or relationships more generally. So if you want to be a very happy person, you need those strong relationships. And so that's the context in which I'm studying the effects of smartphones, because if you're not paying attention to your friends, when they're talking to you, maybe you're not maximizing your well-being.
So is it the strength of the connection with the person, or is it also, is it the strength of the connection, or is it the frequency or length of time at which you engage with that person, or that set of people?
Well, it's all of those things. So first of all, yes, I mean, having a couple of really good friends, in the literature they're called, close confidants, meaning that, you need a few people that you can confide in, meaning, when things get bad, do you have somebody to turn to rely on for social support and so forth. Now that's essential, but it's about that any kind of social interaction, including with, your closest friends, but also with, coworkers. But it turns out the latest research suggests that even interacting with strangers, complete strangers, is actually associated with feeling better. Now, a really interesting study was done by Nick Epley and Juliana Schroeder on the metro or subway in Chicago. Now, they asked people, commuters on the Chicago subway, or randomly assigned them in one of two conditions. So they asked them to either try to spark a conversation with somebody during their commute, or to, not talk to anybody as usual. And they asked actually people to predict how they would feel, how those interactions would go. And most people thought that it would be terrible. Nobody would want to talk to them. But in reality, virtually everybody found a person that they could talk to, and they felt happier at the end of their commute. Now, making a commute happier, that says a lot. So there's all this research suggesting that social interactions in general, it doesn't have to be with a friend, are good for our sense of well-being, and more generally our sense of connection, our sense of community, and so forth.
That's good to know. Anything to make a commute better would be wonderful. So I understand you've done some research around parenthood and subjective well-being. So what's going on there?
Well, it's complicated. Now, so a lot of the research when we started researching parenting and well-being, a lot of the findings, the news stories were a lot about how there is a negative association between being a parent and well-being. And so we published the paper sort of triangulating on three different types of methodologies. One of them was ESM, experience sampling methodology, and we found that parents felt happier when they were with their children than when they were not with their children. Now, an earlier study, for example, a Kahneman study that kind of made the news, that parenting is bad for well-being, did find that parenting kind of ranks, I can't remember what it was, but maybe 8th or 9th in terms of well-being on your list of activities that you could be enjoying. But it's worth pointing out that the activities that rank before parenting are relatively infrequent activities. So number one was intimate relations, which basically means, sex. And, having a date or dinner with friends and that sort of thing. Now, of course, these might be more pleasant and be more associated with positive emotions. But on average, when you combine all the activities that people do on a daily basis, we found that being with your children is actually, a happier time than the rest of your day. Now, we also looked at a nationally representative sample from the World Values Survey, and another data set. And so all these three data sets, we found positive associations between being a parent or spending time with your children and well-being. Now, of course, going against some of the previous findings, we got a lot of people that didn't believe our findings. Now, in some sense, who cares what people believe, right? I mean, look at the data. We're showing you the data. We don't care about your opinion. And so, but I think there were some interesting sort of discussions around, why didn't we control for everything else and things like that. But the sort of ultimate answer here is that if different studies find these different associations between being a parent and happiness, it's probably because the answer is it depends. So is a average parent happier than an average non-parent? I mean, perhaps, but in some ways that's not the interesting question, right? What you need to start looking at is, well, who are those parents? Like, are they, what about a teenage mom versus somebody who, has, a plentiful income, for example, to provide for their children and that sort of thing. There's also the issue of gender, right? So fathers in general, the research suggests, to be happier when they're parents than mothers. And that's perhaps because of the role of mothers in upbringing is often to actually, do the hard part of raising children, although fathers have recently stepped in. So again, much like with smartphones, the net effect question becomes uninteresting when you start looking at the fact that there's all these factors that modulate or moderate the effect. And so some parents would be happier than non-parents and others will not.
I feel like, I don't have any children, but when it's parenthood and just having a family is just a completely set of different life experiences. And sure, you can live a very, very good life in this landscape of experience, but I don't know. I think that as human beings, we really want to try and have not only good experience, but like a diverse set of experiences. So I think there's something to be said for just going out and having those new novel experiences. And I thought, parenthood would be one of those things, and something that, from what I've heard, can be incredibly rewarding. And it's easy to see why. I do want to just bounce back to smartphones for a moment, because there's a question that I forgot to ask, and I think it's an important one, and I think our listeners would really appreciate it. And it's, how could we use technology in such a way to, improve our subjective well-being? I understand that you've done work on batching smartphone notifications and checking email and all that sort of stuff. So can you talk to me about some of that work?
Sure, yeah. So we've done a number of studies looking at ways to reduce sort of the negative, distracting effects of our smartphones so that we can reap more of the positive, making our lives easier benefits of these devices. So an earlier study we ran, we focused on students and we manipulated. So for 1 week, we assigned them to turn their phones on Do Not Disturb settings, meaning they didn't get any notifications for 1 week. And for a second week, we asked them to, have their notifications on so that they can hear when they come in, and to have their phones just generally nearby. So that we can maximize that distraction. So we really tried to, sort of maximize the difference between the two conditions. Now, these were the same subjects. So we're comparing the same people when they're on do not disturb versus, what is business as usual for most people. So notifications on. And, we administered a number of different measures, but one of the measures we administered was actually questionnaire or self-read questionnaire about symptoms of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, what we found was that in the week when people were on do not disturb setting, they rated themselves lower in terms of those symptoms, meaning that they were less inattentive and less hyperactive, and accordingly they were more attentive and more inattentive and more hyperactive when they had their notifications. Now, I should say here that, these people were not, they were sort of a general population of students, so they were not all diagnosed with ADHD. But it seems like what this study is suggesting is that the fact that our environment in the past 11, 12 years has been increasingly saturated by distractions and notifications, more and more people might be inching towards, the clinically significant threshold of being inattentive and hyperactive. Now,
and by clinically significant, do you mean that?
To know that.
By clinically significant, do you mean that if they were to be placed in, if they were to be interviewed by a psychiatrist about, to see if they have ADHD, they could actually be diagnosed with it when they might actually not have it?
Yes, I mean, it depends here. So so first of all, when you go to get assessed for ADHD, there's a couple of things that happen. So there are these self-reported measures about how you feel and how inattentive and hyperactive you are in your daily life. But there are also these tasks-based measures, so where you're asked to do a cognitive tasks, to maintain your attention on a computer with a very boring task, that sort of thing. But interestingly, these tasks are typically administered in a very controlled lab environment, meaning there are no distractions, there's nobody else in the room, you're you and the computer. So that does not necessarily reflect how people, how inattentive or hyperactive people are in their daily lives. And so one argument here is that phones might just be making us more hyperactive and inattentive in daily life, but not be messing with the underlying causing underlying cognitive impairments. Though there is a 2009 study in Science that actually showed, surprisingly, that frequent multitaskers, so people who switch between tasks more, actually are worse at measures of attention and worse at multitasking than people who are, tend to maintain attention on one task. Now, from a cognitive psychology perspective, why might that be? Well, it turns out if you're a frequent multitasker, you're basically, all the time, you're not maintaining your attention, you're not training your attention to focus on one thing. So you're actually, if you think of attention as a muscle that you can train, you're basically not training that muscle. And so, but multitasking actually requires being able to very precisely control where attention is directed. And so people who can actually maintain their attention for a long time on a task and don't frequently task might be better at multitasking when they need to do it. And so this perspective would suggest that to the extent phones are increasing multitasking because I'm doing one thing and all of a sudden a friend texts me and I'm responding to them. The fact that I'm not training my attention to not be swayed away by that notification might actually produce difference in those more structured cognitive tasks that are used to evaluate ADHD.
Mm. And that's one of the reasons why you looked into batching smartphone notifications. Is that correct?
That's right. So now, first of all, the premise here was that the do not disturb setting for a week. First of all, I should say not all participants follow the instructions exactly, because it's a very difficult thing to do when people expect you to respond and you don't know that they've texted you, for example. And so it just seems sort of like essentially throwing the baby with the bathwater by, completely getting rid of notifications. And so we designed a study with Dan Ariely and Nick Fitz and a group of tech company researchers. We designed a study where we actually programmed an app on Android to be able to batch notifications in different frequencies. And so we essentially had 4 conditions in that study. And one condition was basically no notifications the whole day. Now, I should point out here that people, just like with Do Not Disturb, could still see if somebody sent them a message. They would just never get the notification, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Won't know when it arrived or that it has arrived until they go and open the app. Anyway, so that's one condition. Now, 2 of the conditions were batching conditions. So batching means that all the notifications that are received in a certain period are delivered together. And so what that means is that, so the 2 conditions were 3 times a day, which means that there were 3 batches. 11 a.m. at 5 p.m. and 9 p.m., something like that. So 3 times a day. And there was actually a batch condition that was once an hour. So at the end of the hour, you got all the notifications that you got in the... and the 4th condition was control. So, again, business as usual, you get your notifications as they come in. Now, interestingly, what we found was that, first of all, there were not really any differences between the regular control condition and batching notifications once an hour. So that might be a little bit too frequent of batching. So, if you get distracted by your phone every hour, you still end up feeling more inattentive, more stressed, less happy, and so forth. But the condition that really showed the biggest improvement in terms of well-being, attention, lower stress, greater perceived productivity, so feeling like was the batching 3 times a day. So it seems like there is this middle way where, you still get your notifications, but they just don't arrive at a random sort of order, distracting you whenever. And the fact that they are batched in such a way that when they'll arrive, you can almost deal with them piecemeal, right? You can do your work, then at 5 p.m., you get all your notifications and you can respond to everybody and that sort of thing. Now, interestingly, the condition where people got no notifications. In that conditions, we didn't find such improvements on happiness as with the batching 3 times a day. And part of the reason there was that there was this increased FOMO, or fear of missing out. And it seemed like this fear of missing out actually caused people to feel more anxious, which makes sense, right? You just feel like you might be missing out on important things. Maybe somebody important texted you, maybe your boss texted you and you don't know. And in fact, we didn't really measure that or quantify that, but it's possible that when you ask people not to receive notifications, they actually self-interrupt more frequently. So they, you don't know if you got any notifications, so you go and like check your phone more frequently. And so it seems like this idea of batching is a really promising idea to kind of keep the baby, but throw away the bathwater.
Alrighty, so that's very good to know. So batching 3 times or every 3 hours. That sounds definitely doable. And I've found that when I'm on Do Not Disturb, because I'm not getting any of the notifications, I find myself, as you said, more drawn to checking the phone itself. And I may be checking it, once every half an hour or whatever. I see myself, glance at the phone or look at where I think I've placed it. There's like this calling in a way. It's quite disconcerting. These devices really have quite a strong pull on us, and it's for obvious reasons. They're like a portal to just an infinite bounty of information and entertainment and connection. So.
Yeah, exactly. And so batching, there's nothing magical, to be clear, about 3 times a day. Maybe 4 times a day would work better. Who knows? We didn't check that. But the point is, a few times a day you do, and it's important to note here that, all my studies, we're looking at average effects between groups, right? And so it's important to emphasize here that there's no magical number that works for everybody. Now, I remember people interviewing me for a study on email notifications that I did earlier in my career, and lots of journalists pointed out that it is not really an option for them to check their email 3 times a day because their job requires it to check it much more often. And so it is important to know that the ideal number of times you check your phone or batch your notifications would vary person by person. So there's no magical number.
Of course. So I'd like to move on to money and well-being, money and happiness, something that society seems to be historically overwhelmingly interested in. And it seems to, from what I've learned looking at your work, seems to be rather important. So what is the relationship between money or income and subjective well-being?
Yes. So generally, money is good. Money is good for well-being, but it is less good, perhaps, than people expect. Now, when we talk about the relationship between income and happiness, we really need to start talking about the different components of subjective well-being that we talked about earlier. As you remember, those were positive emotions, negative emotions, and life satisfaction, so more the cognitive components. Now, it turns out that in general, especially in those, again, large representative surveys like, Gallup or World Value Survey and so forth, where people are asked how satisfied they are with their lives. There is basically the more money, the higher income you have, the higher your life satisfaction is. Now that makes sense, as I said earlier. When you're judging your life, when you're asked how satisfied you are with your life, or asked like, would you change anything about your life if you can live it over, those sorts of questions. And you look around and, you live in an amazing house and, drive a wonderful car and can afford food and all these things. You generally say that, yeah, I guess I'm pretty satisfied with my life. But it turns out that when it comes to positive emotions on a daily basis, so how much, for example, you smile or laugh in a particular day, or how happy you feel, again, in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, for example, then the relationship between money and happiness becomes a little bit more complicated. And in general, a lot of research has concluded that there is this sort of curvilinear relationship, which basically means that having higher income matters a lot if you're poor. So going from, in the US, from, let's say, 10,000 a year to 20,000 a year does tend to make people experience more positive emotions on a daily life now, in their daily life. Now, you can see why that might be, because, 10,000 a year might not be enough to, get you enough food even to eat or a place to stay. A 2010 study on Kahneman and Deaton study sort of concluded that the curve really flattens around 75,000 household income. Now, this made a lot of news at the time. Now, I want to emphasize again that there's nothing magical about 75,000. The underlying idea is that once you have enough income to meet your basic needs, and maybe a little bit more than your basic needs. Having enough food, having shelter, having, at least some free leisure time, having enough money to be able to go out with friends every once in a while, is important for your daily happiness. But once you have enough, getting more doesn't really change your will, sort of daily experience positive emotions all that much. Now, in my own research, we actually looked at a data set that actually had ESM data, nationally representative ESM data, meaning that people were asked about, how they felt during 3 different episodes of their previous day. So it was measuring happiness, not over an entire day, but during specific activities. And interestingly, that was a representative sample of the US from the American Time Use Survey. And what we found there, interestingly, so the question about happiness, how happy you felt, there was a 0 relationship between having more income and being happier. Now, that seems a little weird, perhaps, but it has actually been replicated. We replicated that with a similar data set in Germany, and we recently replicated it again with a new data set. So it seems that finding actually seems to stand. Now, why that might be, we're not sure. Maybe it's because, having more money is actually in and of itself associated with more stress in other ways, so doesn't contribute to your happiness all that much. Now,
what about hedonic adaptation? Is that the right term for it? Where you just adapt? I said hedonic adaptation. I can't remember if that's the right term for it. But you just adapt to your new circumstances quite
right.
quickly.
That's a really good point. So hedonic adaptation would be another explanation for this. So this is the idea that, yes, going from 20 to 30,000 makes you happier for maybe a month, maybe a 2, maybe a 3-month period. But eventually you kind of adjust to that and then start looking at making 40,000. There's also the effect of social comparison, in particular upward social comparison. So looking at how much your neighbors are making. So when you start making more money, being able to afford perhaps better housing, you move to areas with, where other people are generally also making more money. So all of a sudden, you might still feel poorer. Now, what we did find, though, interestingly, in both of those data sets, the Germany and the United States data sets, is that having more income was related to lower sadness on a daily basis. So it's kind of like this distinction. It's sort of a weird finding, because often people think of happiness and sadness as sort of the two opposite ends of the same continuum, but that's not necessarily the case, right? Like happiness and sadness are negatively related. Happy people would be generally less sad, but they're independent or unique emotions, right? I mean, you can think of many situations where people have these mixed emotions, both happiness and sadness, right? So anyway, so we find that for whatever reason, so maybe more income actually is not so much makes you happier on a daily basis, but it seems to protect you against negative emotions such as sadness. Now, I should make it clear here that this is the representative data set, so there's very limited number of items being people are asked about. And so, perhaps we'll find the same findings for other negative emotions, but those are the emotions that were measured, happiness and sadness. And so higher income, lower sadness.
So I understand you did some research looking into progressive taxation and how it relates to happiness. Could you talk to me a bit about that and income inequality?
Yes. So in that research, we looked at, again, the United States. And it turns out that between 1962 and 2014 in the United States, the rate of progressive taxation in the country just changed multiple times. It both went up and went down. And so this kind of provides us with this time period where we can study whether these changes in the progressive taxation rate had an effect on people's well-being on average. Now, I should define here that progressive taxation basically means, so we're all on the same page, it means that the richer are taxed higher rate than those who make less money. And so, think Sweden type of thing.
And the more you make, the more you pay in taxes. So it's not only the richer pay more, but it's like the richer you get, the more and more you have to pay up until who knows what, like the ceiling. I think from memory, it was as high as 70% or maybe even higher in the US last century.
Yes. Yeah. So it went up to up to 70% at one point, from as low as, 12% maybe. Can't remember, but yeah, pretty low. So yeah, so about 10% to 70%. So
wow,
really, so I mean, so I think, so after the Reagan years, it seemed to have been pretty low in the sort of 70s and early 80s. It was pretty high. Anyway, so that is, the data set we work with. Now, what we then did is there's also, turns out, nationally representative data for the United States actually it's from 1972, a little shorter period, to 2014. And, they basically asked how happy they feel. And it's a very limited scale. So it's, I think, not very happy, pretty happy and very happy. And so with this limited scale, which, when you have a limited scale, you'd expect the effects to be smaller than if you use an actual, real, validated scale. We did find a relationship between progressive taxation and the well-being of the nation. And in particular, what we did was we were able to look with time-lagged analyses, essentially look at what happens to happiness up to 5 years after the progressive taxation rate changes, right? So if the progressive taxation rate goes up, does happiness also go up, or does it go down? And the other way around. And we did actually find that and we actually looked at income inequality in that context as well. Finding that higher progressive taxation predicted increasingly lower income inequality up to 5 years later. So, and of course that makes sense, right? If you are taxing the richer more and taxing the poorer less, then income inequality should go down, and that's exactly what happens. Now, what we found is that on average, higher progressive taxation was actually associated with, on average, the nation being happier. But interestingly, when we broke it down by the income distribution, what we found was that the lowest 40% of the income distribution, meaning the poorest 40% of Americans, tended to be happier when in years of high progressive taxation, whereas the richest 20% were actually not less happy or significantly less happy. So they're taxed more, but they are not less happy. Now, of course, when we think about this finding in retrospect, that makes a lot of sense, right? So, I mean, if you're rich and have all these resources, being taxed a lot, I mean, maybe it makes you a little, annoyed and that sort of thing. But really, your life isn't on a daily basis much worse than before, right? You can still afford great things and expensive wines and whatever. Whereas, of course, you're in the bottom 40%, being taxed less can actually have a real impact on your daily life and on your happiness. And finally, we found that this effect on progressive taxation was actually explained in large this effect of progressive taxation on happiness was explained by a large part by the effect of progressive taxation on income inequality. So in other words, to the extent that progressive taxation decreased income inequality, people felt happier. And in particular, the lowest 40%. Now, the middle 40% of the population, so, those making median income and a little bit higher, there was no effect for them of progressive taxation, which I guess kind of makes sense as well. Now, interestingly, we, in a separate sample with, a modern sample from 2016, we actually asked people to predict how, the richest 20% and the poorest 20% of Americans would feel under these progressive taxation schemes, right? Like 70% down to 10%. And it turns out that, as you can expect, people did predict that the poorer would feel happier when they're taxed less and the richer taxed more. But interestingly, they also expected that the richer, the top 20% of the richest Americans would feel less happy when they're taxed more. But again, that's not what we find. So there's no effect on the richer, but there is an effect. So overall, the net effect here seems to be positive.
And going off how we began our conversation, not only is it nice it's obviously nice to have a happier population, but a happy population is a more productive population.
That's right. So there's lots of research now showing that happier people in general, but in particular in organizations, are actually more productive, and not just more productive, but they're less likely, for example, to quit their jobs, which actually costs a lot of money for retraining and that sort of thing for companies. There is evidence for that happier workers, for example, are less likely to, I think the word is shirking, maybe, am I mixing this up, but basically pretending to be sick and not going to work, and so forth. So yes, and a lot of this research, I should say, is correlational, but there is some causal evidence from longitudinal research, which allows us to look at the effects of being happy earlier to being more productive later, excluding the possibility that being more productive makes you happier.
So I understand that a number of countries are trying to, we generally measure how well a country is performing by GDP, and that has over the years attracted a lot of ire, and it's just a bit silly when you think about it. And some other countries are looking at other measures of a country's success. I think Bhutan measures happiness, and New Zealand has recently just announced a well-being budget. Do you know much about New Zealand's well-being budget, and I guess more broadly these movements towards measuring or organizing society through well-being? And if you are familiar with some of it, could you give me your thoughts on that, I guess, movement?
Yeah, sure. So before becoming an assistant professor at Georgetown, I was a postdoc at University of Virginia, where I worked with Ed Diener, who really kind of started this movement of well-being research in the 80s, and because psychology in the 80s and 70s and back was really focused on all these negative things, how obedient to people and conformity and mental illness only, sort of ignoring the good side of human nature. And Ed actually is, I think, a senior scientist at Gallup. So he's really been working hard, amongst others as well, to promote this idea that we should be assessing the prosperity of nations, not just by GDP, but also by all these other more subjective measures of well-being. So are people actually happier? Are they more satisfied? But also, there is, this idea of focusing on other objective indices. So does everybody have access to healthcare, for example? What about good education, and so forth? So all these sort of social goods that, we can all pretty much agree make for a prosperous society. And a number of indices have emerged that now can rank countries by those indices. And there is a lot of sort of survey and representative surveys now that actually assess, how happy people feel. So the data is there. So there's nothing stopping us from moving away from this very narrow economic view of prosperity. I mean, GDP in particular is like, you could, as it's happening
all
in the
you
United
need to
States,
do is
right,
look at
there's
the
a lot of
US.
talk about the 1%. Pardon me?
All you need to do is look at the US. I've spent a lot of time there over the past few years, and it does not, like, there's a feeling in many of this. I've been, Seattle, Los Angeles, like basically all the corners, like, Vermont, Florida, and there's just a bit of a feeling of discontent in the air. And even though it's, it's got the highest GDP in the world, right? That does not map onto the well-being of a nation, and you can just feel it. And I know that by other measures, the feeling's there, but if you look at all sorts of measures from, health, educational outcomes, all these things, the US just doesn't, it's just not performing.
Yeah, exactly. And really, I mean, the extent of the income inequality, it's it has been going steadily towards more inequality. But, for example, 20% of US households, so those top 20% of income earners that we talked about with progressive taxation own in the United States 84% of the wealth. And people have an awareness of this issue, but they underestimate it. So, for example, the average American believes that the richest fifth of Americans own about 60% of the wealth, but actually it's 84%, right? And strikingly, that bottom 40%, again, that we talked about in progressive taxation, combined. So the wealth that they own combined is a paltry 0.3%, so less than 1% of the wealth. I mean, that is crazy, right?
Wow.
It's bad.
Yeah, and we use money as a way of signaling. I see money as water or energy, and each of us, we use it in a way that we think is going to be beneficial, not only for us, but in general. And I think by concentrating that in the hands of so few, we're actually doing a disservice to everyone, because our perspectives and how we think we should spend our money, I think, is a lot more valuable than we give credit to. I mean, for instance, what I would love is if a percentage of our income goes towards the arts. So we pay taxes, and a percentage of that goes towards the arts and goes towards supporting artists and musicians and yada yada yada. So the governments they've got this challenge of trying to allocate that money in such a way in this specifically related to the arts, in such a way that ideally promotes artistic expression and makes as many people in the country as happy as possible, I guess, with regards to that, to the arts. So instead of giving the government that right, or instead of giving them all of that power, it would make a lot more sense to at least distribute a portion of that buying power back to the citizens, where they could then give money to the artists and the musicians and the creators that they actually support, that they actually want to support, and that they want to support the work of. Because the government they can't calculate, or they don't know the preferences of each of their people, of their citizens. And it's just like, it's informationally or epistemically, what's the word I'm looking for? Shit, for lack of a better term.
Yes.
It's quite frustrating. It's quite frustrating. So we were just talking about income inequality. I'd like to move towards a term that's that's, I guess, related to well-being, but might be qualitatively different. And that's living a psychologically rich life. So what is a psychologically rich life? And how does it differ to well-being?
Well, so we've talked a lot about... Sure, yeah. So we've talked a lot about, the happy life. Now, what we haven't really touched upon is what, some people would call the meaningful life. But, if we think about ancient Greek philosophers, they distinguish between, hedonia and eudaimonia. Now, hedonic well-being means enjoying a really nice food, so enjoying life, feeling more joy and that sort of thing. Eudaimonic well-being is more about, meaning, self-actualization, achieving your highest potential, being a contributing member of society. Now, people have distinguished between these two things as if they're two opposite things. You can either live a life of pleasure or a life of meaning. In reality, the data suggests that those two things are very closely associated. So when people are, leading more meaningful and purposeful lives, they tend to be happier, more joyful, and so forth. But it turns out that when people are in a better mood, they actually tend to rate their lives as more meaningful. So it seems like there's this two-way street here. So actually enjoying some small pleasures of life might actually be good for your meaning as well. Now, that's the reason why I'm telling you this, is because these, the meaningful and happy life has really been the focus of the literature for years and years. Now, with Shigehiro Oishi, and his large team of researchers at the University of Virginia, we started wondering whether these two things, the happy life and the meaningful eudaimonic life, might actually be missing something. And it seemed to us that there is this third possibility for a psychologically rich life, which again would be associated positively with the happy life and the meaningful life, but would be still distinct from them. And the idea here, in some ways you can think of the psychologically rich life as the interesting life. So you are not necessarily seeking purpose. You're not focusing on, changing the world, for example. But you're focusing on, traveling a lot, or, reading really deep poetry, and or just reading, all kinds of books, for example. So I, as you know, for example, am from, or maybe you don't know, but I'm from Bulgaria originally. I grew up in Bulgaria. I moved to the United States for college. A year later, I went to England. I spent a summer working in Greece. So I've lived all over the place. I moved to Canada for my PhD. And all this moving, I'm a generally happy person, but I would say the thing that moved me through all of these things is the desire to experience something new, something interesting, something novel. It's not the desire to find happiness or find meaning necessarily, right? It is this desire for novelty, in a sense. And it's worth pointing out that in actuality, when you move, eventually I've been happy in all these places. But at first, first of all, all your friends from the previous place are, poof, disappeared, right? I mean, there's social media and phones, but really it's not the same. So it's challenging. You go through periods of, feeling frustrated, feeling a little alone, not experiencing as many positive emotions. But in the end of the day, what this results in is perhaps a more interesting or psychologically rich life. The idea being that you're not aiming for positive emotions, you're just aiming for experiencing, the full range of emotions, whether they're positive or negative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it makes me think that there could be the way intuitively, the way psychologically rich life links to, I guess, meaning more so than happiness is that through the experiencing of novel things, you're like, what is novelty? It's like, it's rooted in information that is unique, that you haven't come across before. And when you come across anything that you haven't encountered before, it could be, whatever you're coming across could be potentially useful. So this, by experiencing novelty, what we're actually doing is identifying, or we have the potential to identify things, whatever they could be, ways of being, or books, or ideas that could be potentially useful. And by useful, I mean being able to be put that information or that knowledge or the experiences could be put towards meaningful endeavors. So it's kind of like is the psychologically rich life is it's a way, or endeavoring towards that is a way of increasing the arsenal of potentially useful things to live a more meaningful life.
Yeah, exactly. And, in many in many senses, that's probably not the right expression, but when you are experiencing more novelty, experiencing all these new things, I mean, you're in some sense increasing the chances, perhaps, that you might find your calling, right? Yeah, and a meaningful life, really, a eudaimonic life, is really fundamentally about, what's your calling, what's your purpose on this earth, right? And so I think, but that said, again, it's not necessarily the same thing, because you can also argue that, let's say, 200 years ago, when people couldn't travel wherever in the world and they were essentially spend their entire life in their little village. I mean, you could totally have a very, very meaningful life. You have your role as, whoever in that village. And, that's your role, that's your calling. In some sense, today we have so much choice in terms of figuring out what our calling is, that might result in, never being sure what your calling is, right?
Well, the problem
but I do agree that
the chances are there is another path that could provide greater amounts of, if we were to quantify flourishing or happiness, given that we have next to what seems like an infinite amount of potential lives that we could live, the chances are that the life that we are living is not the best one. And I see this as a bit of a problem with, I guess, generations alive, let's say the millennials and Gen Z more specifically, because the internet and the world's just, I think the tables have been flipped, and we're beginning to realize that we have such tremendous freedom to carve out a life to carve out lives that we may not have been able to live, just a few decades ago. And with that amount of freedom comes a bit of angst, because it's the paradox of choice. If we've got such a huge amount of things to choose from, that brings about some negative emotion in of itself, because you just think that you're missing out.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I agree that you brought up the paradox of choice, and as you know, there's a lot of research on this, basically showing that when you have a lot of choice, you actually might end up liking whatever you choose less than if you had a little bit of choice. I mean, choice is good. So being able to choose between two options, that's great. But having to decide between, 10 options, you always wonder, oh my God, maybe this other thing would be better. And there's lots of research that in terms of how much people like consumer products to, jams that they buy at the store. And so, but if we apply this reasoning to, finding your calling, yes, if you basically have an infinite amount of things you can do with your life, and should I go this way? Should I go that way? Well, that might actually decrease your chances of finding your calling, because your calling, how can we define this, right? Like, we often think of it as something, it just clicks, right? But for it to click, I guess we have to be, what we mean is like, we need to be sure that that's our calling. But with so much choice, it might be more difficult to discover that. Now, from that perspective, I would say that this search for novelty, the psychologically rich life, might actually, in some cases, decrease the chances of finding a meaningful life, right? Because in a lot of sense, a meaningful life is potentially a very boring life. It's just focusing on one thing, making a change in the world or contributing to something beyond yourself. Parenting, for example, we talked about earlier. The research actually suggests very clearly, there's no debate about that, parents find their lives more meaningful than non-parents. So having children, definitely very good for a purposeful and meaningful life. And it's because, you do have a purpose. You have to raise a human being. That's, there's not, and once you have a child, you don't have too much choice around whether, you can do that or not, right? And so it kind of becomes your calling naturally. And so, in some ways, but, parents, notoriously, I guess, don't have necessarily very interesting lives because, it's very structured. You go to work, you pick up your kids, but yeah, so in some ways, I think there is some overlap between psychologically rich and meaningful life, but they're definitely distinct things. It could go either way.
Yeah. My point was more the psychologically rich life can help one live a more meaningful life just by virtue of contributing to the arsenal of information at our disposal and like an understanding of the ways in which we can be in the world. This makes me think
I see. So
yeah. So it's like a
toolbox that you have. Yes.
Yeah, and just like being, I see this as a landscape of potential lives that we could live. So imagine that there's a 3-dimensional landscape, and each position on the landscape has a different height. And where you are on that landscape is associated with different ways of being. So where I am right now, let's say I'm at on one location, I'm an artist. Somewhere else, I'm a parent. And so each location on this map is associated with a different life lived. And the height of that, the elevation of that point is the amount of flourishing that you experience living that life. So obviously, each of us would have different maps. And so for myself, my map might be very, very high. The location where I'm a professional podcaster, that may be the life in which I experience the most amount of flourishing. So what I see the role of governments in a way is to try and increase the square mileage. So you could think of it as like the freedom of choice made available to individuals so that they can try and identify where on the map, which life they could live to live the most meaningful life, or the life that brings in the most amount of flourishing. And, based on our conversation and like the thoughts I've had in the past, this is economically, like this approach seems to be economically productive, because when people live lives that they deem to be flourishing or, happy, they are better citizens. So it's this wonderful cycle, or this wonderful spiral of prosperity and just positivity.
Yeah, exactly. And I think your point goes or ties really well with what we discussed earlier about the income findings, where it's really clear that the relationship about income and happiness is a story about, do you have enough money to cover your basis, live in a safe, secure environment, be able to provide food for yourself and your family. And at that point, once you meet those needs, I think that's, I would argue, perhaps the point where, you do become more free to choose. Right? Otherwise, you're essentially
economically enslaved.
Just striving to survive, maybe not get evicted, maybe protecting your children from not getting shot, and so forth. And it's really interesting. So your point made me think of this research on scarcity, which is the idea that when people have scarce resources, so for example, not a lot of money, cognitively, what happens is that people become sort of hyper.
Hey, yep. Sorry, I just lost you. I think you were saying that there's the study on scarcity and how having scarce resources reduces your cognitive capacity or bandwidth.
Yes, but just to be clear, it's a psychological mechanism. It's not something about, you don't get enough nutrients or something like that. But just basically, I mean, one way to think about it is if you don't have enough resources and you constantly have to think about how to survive and how you're going to make it to the next paycheck, that becomes the focus of your life, survival, the now. So, but the effect of that is that you fail to think about the future. So think about a good example of that is the predatory payday loans, right? I mean, you think, why would anybody, go and get this super expensive loan and get themselves into this situation? And the answer is very simple. I mean, if you don't have money to buy your kids food, I mean, you'll do anything in that particular moment. Of course, you won't consider that in a month you'll be even in a worse situation. But anyway, so my point here is that when you have 40% of the people in the US having 0.3% of the wealth, you have a problem because these people aren't free. They are focused on one thing, and that thing is not contributing to society. That thing is not finding novel experiences, and that thing is not, pleasure and being happy. What it is survival, and it's a cycle that perpetuates itself. So I do think that governments have an important role to play here in, raising people out of poverty. This sort of individualistic Western idea of, everybody on their own and work hard and everything would work out does not work if you.
Well, it's an ignorant perspective, because to believe that we are solely responsible for the circumstances of our lives is just completely absurd. We are not responsible for where we are born. We are not responsible for our genetic endowments, whether or not they're positive or negative. We're not responsible for the income of our parents. We are not responsible for the technologies and freedoms that we have available to us. And to think that we are entirely responsible for the income that we generate or that we don't generate when it seems that we're not responsible for anything else is just completely absurd. Like, to think that we actually have completely free will is something that's called into question. And we don't need to get too philosophical about this, because, all we need to do is think about the, Brexit and the Trump election and the influence advertising can have on our decisions, on our decision making. Like, you don't need to think very hard at all to really see why these notions that, we are solely responsible for our actions are just completely absurd. And it makes a lot of sense, not just from this perspective, but also from a a social, from a societal well-being perspective, to just be a little bit more caring and understanding, because it turns out that it makes for a better society for everyone. Like the rising tide lifts all boats. It's and I think we need to extend this line of thinking globally, because we do not exist as isolated islands. Like, we are using technologies that the whole world has contributed to making. And, the materials that go into our phones are sourced globally. So it's not like we're on this, where these little ships or these isolated nations competing against each other and trying to all grow up. We're actually interconnected in ways that we can't even understand, like beyond our comprehension. So we should act accordingly. Sorry, it just pisses me off.
Yeah. So I have a couple of points to make here. So first of all, it's completely absurd. However, I was actually just teaching my students in social psychology yesterday about something called the fundamental attribution error. And what that means is that in the West, Western countries, more individualistic countries, what happens is that when people see a stranger act a certain way, do something bad, for example, people automatically attribute that behavior to, dispositional or personality characteristics about this person. So this person acted badly because they're a bad person. Now, in more collectivistic cultures like Japan and China, people do tend to take the context more into consideration. This person acted badly, because, I don't know, they, they were really hungry or something or whatever, right? So they'll take the context more into consideration. But my point here is that there is this cultural bias in the West that basically makes us automatically attribute, when something bad happens to you, it's because of you doing something. It's rather than taking the context into consideration. And we only take the context into consideration through effort. We have to be motivated, and we have to have the cognitive resources to actually think about it. It doesn't come naturally. So that's one point. The other point is, I completely agree with you about the ridiculousness. In some ways, so here is one thing I kind of wonder more at a philosophical level. Like, why is a truck driver making so much less money than, a CEO? Are they working less hard, really? I'm pretty sure that a lot of the, the
hardest workers are the lowest income earners. Like people scrubbing toilets and picking up the rubbish. Bless them. Bless them.
I know, exactly. Yeah, and I think your point about interconnectedness is really important. If you don't value truck drivers or your delivery men to pay them enough money, try living in a society that there are no truck drivers. Like, how are you going to get your, new iPhone and stuff delivered, right? It's just completely ridiculous. But I think, of course, the answer is, well, more skilled workers, get more money. But then I think that's where the idea of progressive taxation becomes very useful. It's like, okay, sure, like you studied a lot, whatever, you're really skilled at managing an organization, sure, get some more money. But yeah, we will tax you at 70% and we will tax the truck driver at, 0%, so that we don't have this ridiculous disparity. Because at the end of the day, the CEO cannot exist without his workers.
Yeah. And to be honest, I don't even think it's not our money. Like money, whatever, it's not this thing. Like money cannot exist in isolation. I just can't exist by myself without society and then have this thing called money. Money it requires social connection to exist. So the idea that we own our money, I think, is completely flawed. Even the money that we generate, because it requires demand from others. It requires that sense of recognition. So money itself seems to be this resource that we as a society allocate to people who are doing things that we deem to be socially valuable. And it turns out that having money grants you a tremendous amount of freedom, right? And so that's the positive thing. So it's like, hey, thank you for doing that thing that is beneficial to society. Here's some money as a reward so that you can go and live a better life. We appreciate that, but you don't get all of it because we need this. We need this money to, we use this to try and, this is why I like the water or energy analogy, because we use the money to go and, as a society, improve things that we think that we think need to be improved. So healthcare, education, roads, and all that, things that are better for everyone. And I think we're at a point now where we need to extend this line of, we're at a point now where we live in a global society, and we need to extend this line of thinking to the entire planet, not just the nation state, because we live in a global society, and we should act accordingly. And unfortunately, we're kind of stuck in this. We're about to go through a bit of a transformation, and I don't know how. I think it could. At the end of the day, it'll be good, but I think it might get messy initially, and that's just because we've these nation states with big guns whose sole role is to, survive firstly, and then provide for their citizens. But the providing for the citizens and maintaining human rights seems to be an afterthought.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say here that, look, so, I mean, humans are, a product of evolution. And so, I mean, it was perhaps evolutionarily advantageous in the early days to be, suspicious of the people from the other tribe and make sure you protect your in-group, the people that are around you. So there's something very basic about human psychology that is, that is very appealing to sort of latch on to a group. And when the economy is doing poorly, or, your family is doing poorly, you feel insecure, the tendency is to actually latch on to we versus them. It gives you a sense of meaning, purpose, security. And so, anyway, my point is, I don't know if we'll, in the next few years, get past that basic psychological tendency to see the world in us versus them. But I think what we can do is we change the us versus them from countries to something else, right? So rather than it being like I'm a this citizen or I'm a that citizen, it's I'm a supporter of Barcelona Football Club, or I'm a we just kind of shift the tribal these tribal tendencies to things that don't have such a huge, let's say, existential potential cost. We try and leverage it in a positive way, but right now I see it as rather dangerous. Yeah, and I think an important point here is Pinker in a new book, or maybe it's an article, basically shows that Steven Pinker shows that. In general, as much as we constantly think that, things are about to implode and get worse, when you look at, things like the number of people that die in wars, the number of people that die of hunger in the world, the number of people that die from, even violent crime in the United States, even though, there's these mass shootings, which is an important issue, of course. But overall, on average, these numbers are all decreasing. World hunger has decreased by, I don't know how much, but a lot in the past half century, right? So in general, things are getting better. Now, I think one thing that might, throw things off that we've never faced before is this idea of, well, not this idea, but climate change.
Yeah,
right? That's something that, but I think part of what's going on is that it's politically expedient to make people feel like things are, headed for disaster when the country is, ruled by the other team. and that makes people latch onto more into their in-group, right? I mean, in the US, there is some recent research that suggests that the political parties here, Republicans and Democrats, are actually behaving more like religious groups rather than political groups. Now, what that means is that, it's not any longer about exchanging arguments and disagreeing and sort of the more rational thing. It's really about, us versus them. They're the bad people. We're the good people, and it's really become about like group identity rather than any sort of reasonable conversation about what's good for the country.
Yeah. Well, I think reasonable is like, we throw this term reasonable and rational around a lot, but I think it's, we have a very high opinion of ourselves as a species. And while we have the capacity to be rational, to think that we make all of our decisions rationally is just completely absurd. And anyone like I the number of times I make decisions that are best for me, like definitely in the minority. Like there might be a glass of wine here when I really know I shouldn't. Even the night before a podcast, I didn't do that one. I didn't do that last night. I was prepared for this, but or anything else. I've heard that one of the hypotheses for how rationality developed was so that we could explain our actions retrospectively to other members of our social group, so that we could. It wasn't that we thought things through first and then acted, but it was a way for us to try and provide some semblance of sense behind our actions. And I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's quite funny.
Yeah, no, that makes.
I've just heard that
makes a lot of sense, and there's a lot of research showing that that's precisely the case. So
post hoc rationalization.
There's a number of studies showing that you can sort of subliminally influence people's choice of something, but then when they actually choose that something that you have somehow, as an experimenter made them choose, and it's true because you can compare it to the other group. People don't give you, these very convincing explanations why they chose that item versus the other item. Does that make sense? So they have were under your influence, but they are very good at, and of course when you tell them that's what, the reason why they chose this is because you structured the situation in a particular way. They like nobody believes you, right? And so
that reminds me of a lecture series that I've started watching. There's this guy called John Vervaeke. I think he's a cognitive scientist out at the University of Toronto. I could be wrong, but he's got this, like, I've only just started, but it's this huge lecture series on, well, he's titled it Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And he talks about different types of knowing. And, in philosophy, knowledge is justified as, well, it's I think to know something or truth is, justified. Yeah, knowledge is justified true belief. But we tend to know things that we can't really explain rationally. We tend to know things deep down that we might not actually believe, but we just know. Like an example could be, I don't know, murder is wrong, or maybe that's not the best example, but he goes into a specific, he gives a specific example of where people were shown random strings of digits or letters, and they were meant to determine if they followed or if they adhered to a particular pattern. And they'd be shown a string of digits or numbers, and they would say, yes, this follows the pattern, or no, this follows the pattern. It's not specifically this, but it's something like that. And it turns out that people could correctly identify these things quite accurately, but they had absolutely no idea why. So they knew at like a cognitive subconscious level, but they couldn't articulate it. So this, what does it mean to know?
Interesting.
So it's like rationality. I think rationality is, well, I think we need to really we need to come up with different definitions, because we can act rationally without being able to explain why the action is correct. I think, I think our intuitions are actually far more accurate and far more attuned to the maximization of order in the world than we give them credit for. So we say, people are behaving irrationally, the classic
and I think
economist stuff. I was just going to say, the classic homo economicus, like people behave irrationally because they spend an extra dollar on water when they could go across the road and buy it. Like, well, maybe we're actually a lot more rational than we give ourselves credit for, but our understanding of why is so limited.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that idea of, or that realization from behavioral research that our decision making is far from rational, and often the rationale comes after we've made a decision for another reason, is the whole reason behind behavioral economics, the whole idea, right? So moving away from this assumption in economics of this rational decision maker to actually take into consideration how humans actually behave.
I am conscious of our time, so I guess I'll just ask you some wrapping up questions, though. The past hour of the conversation has really been quite riveting. So what are you currently excited about at the moment in your line of work, or in general? It doesn't have to be work. It could be a new flavor of ice cream that's just been offered at a store down the road.
Yes. Well, in my line of work, so as I mentioned earlier, a lot of my research has been focused on the effects of smartphones on well-being, sort of subjective well-being. Now, I am more and more interested in studying the effects of these technologies on physical health, or you can, I guess, call it physical well-being. So, you can, on the one hand, there's all these, apps that help us track our health and exercising and stuff like this. So those might be potentially good for health. But of course, just the amount of time we spend on our devices is staggering. So I run a study with using screen time on the iPhone with my students, right? Screen time basically tells you objectively how much time your screen is on during the day. So that, essentially measuring screen time objectively. And it turns out that one of the most common responses is 6 hours a day. Now, of course, there is a variation. But these are students, right? So their lives are super busy. But somehow, amongst going to classes and sleeping, other things, they actually have their phones on for 6 hours. Now, of course, again, this is perhaps a little extreme, but even if it's 4 hours or 3 hours, that's a lot of time every day to be on your phone. Now, if you're on your phone, perhaps, again, the idea of opportunity cost. So what else aren't you doing? In some sense, at least phones, when we talk about social interactions, well, phones can connect you with friends and, perhaps your boyfriend who is in a different city or whatever. But, they don't help you move or exercise. So if you're spending 6 hours a day on your phone, perhaps you're not doing these other activities. So in some way, I'm almost interested in thinking about screen time as a different type of health behavior, right? So, the Center for Disease Control here in the United States, for example, talks about various health behaviors. Exercise, standing on a regular basis is one of those health behaviors. Sleeping is another one. Smoking is a sort of a negative health behavior. But I think screen time, especially when we think about children too, should be thought of, I think, as an actual health behavior in and of itself, because it's so prevalent and it's so related to these other important health behaviors that we know predict, either living a healthy, long life, or, dying early from disease. So that's one thing that I'm really excited about.
So where can people find out more about your work online?
Well, I'm in a lot of places online. So people can find me on ResearchGate or Academia or Google Scholar, but perhaps the best place to find, copies of all my papers, media articles about my research, and my own sort of popular press articles about describing my studies. If people don't want to read all my papers, would be my website, which is my last name, Kushlev. That's KUSHLEV.com. So Kushlev.com. Kush, like, the wheat, and then Lev, and then that's my website.
And are you on Twitter or?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I am on Twitter as well. On Twitter, I'm at Kushlev.
All these links will be in the...
Yes, at Kushlev PhD is my Twitter account, and I'd love new followers. So please.
Alrighty, well, I'll all the links to a lot of what we spoke about will be found in the show notes, so I'll put that there as well. Do you have a parting message for the listeners out there? Anything you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Well, I would say keep enjoying the benefits that technology is bringing in our lives. I'm a firm believer that these devices are great and very useful. I'm actually waiting on my newest phone right now. So keep using those devices, but just be aware that you might not be aware of all the ways in which these devices might actually make you miss out on opportunities to be happier.
That's a great parting message. Thank you very much for your time, Kosta.
Thank you very much for having me, Sam.
All right. Well, thanks again to Kostadin Kushlev for taking the time to have a chat. If you would like to follow up on some of the things covered in today's conversation, you can head to the show notes on my website at samhbarton.com, and you'll be able to find links to some of the papers discussed, Kostadin's personal website, and his Twitter handle. If you would like to support the show, please consider sharing it on social media and with your friends, or by leaving it a review on iTunes. You can also become a financial supporter of the podcast by becoming a patron. You can find links to that on my website or by heading to patreon.com/SamHBarton. If you would like to keep up to date with new episodes and other stuff that I've got going on, either follow me on social media at SamHBarton or by becoming a subscriber on my website. Thank you again for listening, and until next time.